The summer of 1885 arrived on the Gulf Coast like a slow fire pressing down on the water, bending the marsh grass, turning the air above Mobile Bay into something thick enough to chew. The SS Bremen had been at sea for 19 days. Its passengers had crossed storms off the Azores, endured 8 days of flat, windless ocean that made the heat feel personal, and arrived now at a coastline that looked nothing like the harbor paintings the recruitment agent in Hamburg had shown them. Ottilie Hoffmann stood near the stern as the ship maneuvered toward the dock. She was 30 years old, though the last 3 years had added something to her face that age alone could not explain. Her hair was dark auburn, pulled tight under a gray travel bonnet. Her hands resting on the rail were the hands of someone who had worked with them since the age of 14. The knuckles were slightly enlarged, the skin around the wrists calloused in the particular way of people who knead dough for hours each morning. She held a leather satchel against her side, as though it contained something fragile, which it did. Inside was a single glass jar sealed with wax, a small cloth bundle of dried caraway seeds, and a notebook bound in dark green cloth. The notebook had belonged to Meister Heinrich Baum, master baker of the Altona district of Hamburg, who had trained Ottilie from age 14 until the week of her wedding. On the inside cover, written in his dense, careful hand, "A good loaf of bread requires 3 days and no impatience. The rest is craft, and craft can be learned." She had read those words the morning after her husband Wilhelm died of lung fever in the winter of 1882. She had read them again the morning she signed the recruitment papers. She was reading them now in her memory as the dock came into focus and the sound of American voices rose up from the pier below. Behind her, 33 other women arranged themselves along the rail in various states of exhaustion and apprehension. Most were widows. The Ruhr mining disaster of 1883 had taken the husbands, fathers, and eldest sons from a dozen villages within a 40-mile radius, and what it left behind were women with practical skills, dependent children, and no income. The recruitment agent, a compact man named Drescher, who wore a gold watch he consulted frequently, had come to their villages in the spring of 1885 with an offer that sounded in German like salvation. $8 a month, housing provided, meals included, 3 years of contract labor on American agricultural estates in the state of Mississippi. At the end of 3 years, return passage or permanent settlement, your choice. Hilda Brandt, 19 years old and standing at Ottilie's left elbow, had been the only one among them who read English with any confidence. She had learned it from a second-hand textbook she found in a church donation bin, motivated by nothing more than curiosity and the long winter evenings in Bremen, with nothing else to occupy her. Now that skill made her indispensable, and she was beginning to understand responsible for things she had not anticipated. She had read the full contract on the second day at sea, not the summary Drescher had provided in German, the actual document in English 12 pages long, with clauses written in the compressed legal language of American commerce. She had found the relevant line on page 4 buried in a paragraph about transportation costs. $47 passage fee to be deducted from monthly wages at a rate of no less than $8 per month until the balance is discharged. She had done the arithmetic standing at the porthole with the Atlantic heaving outside. 6 months. 6 months of full wages gone before any of them would see a cent to send home. She had told Ottilie that same evening. Ottilie had listened without expression, then folded her hands in her lap and looked out at the black water for a long time. Finally, she said in the low, deliberate tone she used when she had already decided something and was merely confirming that aloud, "The ship left Hamburg 19 days ago." She did not say anything else. There was nothing else to say. The arithmetic of their situation was what it was, and rearranging its terms would not change the sum. Now on the dock, a man in a brown suit and straw hat held a sign with the name Whitmore printed on it in block letters. He had the look of someone who had been standing in the heat for too long and was conserving his irritation for later. Beside him, 2 wagon drivers leaned against their vehicles and watched the women come down the gangplank with the detached appraisal of men evaluating livestock at a county fair. Ottilie walked down last by choice. She watched each woman ahead of her hand over her papers, receive a number on a slip of card stock, and climb into one of the wagons. When it was her turn, the man in the brown suit looked at her papers, looked at her hands, and then looked at the satchel. "That a medical bag?" he asked. "No," she said. Her English was limited but serviceable, assembled from 2 years of evening classes at a Hamburg trade school she had attended after Wilhelm got sick, when she understood that self-sufficiency was no longer a virtue but a necessity. "It is ingredients," she said, "for bread." The man wrote something in his ledger and waved her toward the second wagon. The road from Mobile to Clarksburg, Mississippi ran through 40 miles of heat in pine forest and red clay soil that turned the wagon wheels a deep orange color. Ottilie watched it from the back of the wagon and noted things the way she always noted things in the particular inventory of a person trained to assess environments for what they could yield. The soil looked rich in some places. The timber was dense. The fields they passed through were enormous by German standards, flat and wide, and worked by crews of people moving slowly in the distance. Nothing about the landscape looked desperate. That was the first thing that surprised her. The second thing was the smell. An hour out from Clarksburg, with the sun dropping toward the tree line, something drifted into the wagon from the direction of the farmsteads they were passing. It was faint at first, sweet and savory at once, with an undertone she could not immediately name. She leaned slightly over the side of the wagon and breathed it in. Corn. But not raw corn, not field corn drying in the autumn air. Something baked. Something that had been subjected to heat and fat and come out transformed into a thing that smelled, she admitted privately, like it had a reason for existing. She sat back. She did not mention it to anyone. The Whitmore estate announced itself first as a white house visible through a long corridor of oak trees. Then, as the wagons came closer, it expanded into a complex of structures. The main house up the slight rise, and below it, arranged along a hard dirt yard, a cookhouse with a wide chimney, a storehouse, a barn, 3 smaller residences for senior staff, and a long, low building that was clearly the workers' quarters. The whole property had the organized, deliberate quality of a place that had been running for a long time under the same hand. Silas Whitmore stood on the front porch of the main house as the wagons pulled into the yard. He was 55 years old, thick through the shoulders with gray at his temples and the upright posture of a former military man. He had served as a captain in the Confederate Army of Northern Virginia, had been wounded at Spotsylvania, and had spent the years since the war rebuilding the estate his father left him, with a combination of disciplined practicality and the quiet stubbornness of a man who has decided that whatever he has left is worth keeping. He had arranged the contracts with the Hamburg agent for one reason stated plainly in the letter. He sent German workers do not strike. He had read about the labor agitation moving through the northern manufacturing cities, the walkouts and union organizing and wage disputes, and he had decided that importing workers from a country with a different tradition of labor was a sensible investment. He was not a cruel man, he was a practical one, which sometimes looks the same from certain angles. Beside him, 1 step back and 1 degree cooler in temperature, stood Eugenia Whitmore. She was 48 years old, the daughter of a Georgia cotton family, a woman who had managed this estate alone for 4 years while Silas was in Virginia and had never once let the books fall into disorder or the fields fall behind schedule. She had opinions about most things and the social authority to express them. She watched the women climb down from the wagons with an expression that was not hostile precisely, but that contained within it the careful calculation of a person deciding how much disruption she was willing to absorb. "They look thin," she said to Silas. "They look capable," he said. "The kitchen situation," she began, "has been handled," he said, which was not entirely true, but which was the thing he chose to say. What Eugenia did not yet know was the letter Silas had sent ahead to his property manager, instructing that if any woman in the incoming group had professional baking experience, she was to be assessed for assignment to the estate bakehouse. The bakehouse oven had been broken since March. The repair contractor had not come and was not expected before September. Silas needed bread for the main house. He needed it made by someone who knew what they were doing. And he needed it made in a kitchen that already existed and already functioned. That kitchen belonged to Vesta Hayes. Vesta was 45 years old and had been cooking for the Whitmore household since 1867, the year Silas returned from the war, and found the estate in a condition that required rebuilding from the foundations up. She had been born on this property in 1840, had spent 25 years as a slave within its boundaries, and had remained after emancipation by choice and by economic calculation. Because Silas paid her a real wage, $6 a month, gave her a private room, and stayed out of her kitchen entirely. That last condition was the one she valued most. The kitchen was hers. It had been hers for 18 years. She knew every inch of its floor, every temperament of its iron stoves, every particular creak of the shelf above the flour barrels, and every morning smell that rose from the ovens when the day's first corn cakes were set to cook. She was not sentimental about it in the way people are sentimental about places they merely love. She was sovereign about it in the way people are sovereign about the only territory they have ever fully controlled. She was standing in the doorway of the cookhouse when the wagons arrived, wiping her hands on her apron, watching. Her assistant, Hattie 16, and newly hired from a family in Clarksburg, stood just behind her and whispered, "Who are all those ladies?" "German women," Vesta said, "contract workers. They look tired." "Long trip," Vesta said. She was not watching the group as a whole. She was watching one woman in particular. The one who had come down the gangplank, last the one who walked differently from the others. Not hesitantly, not with the deflated posture of exhaustion, but with the quiet attention of someone cataloging what they were seeing. The one who held a leather satchel against her body like it contained something worth protecting. That woman glanced toward the cookhouse, and for a fraction of a second, Vesta saw her eyes stop moving. Not at the building, at the smoke coming from the chimney. The kind of look a person gives something they recognize even when they are not expecting to. Vesta said, "Hattie." "Yes. Watch the one with the gray bonnet." The first meal was served that evening in the workers' dining hall, a long, low room with plank tables and oil lamps hanging from the ceiling beams. Vesta's crew had prepared it, as they always did, substantial, straightforward, built for people who had worked and needed to continue working. Salt pork and beans, roasted sweet potatoes, biscuits, and cornbread cut into square portions and stacked in baskets along the center of each table. Ottilie sat down, looked at the food, and began eating the pork and beans without ceremony. Then she reached for the cornbread. She did not take a bite immediately. She held it for a moment. It was heavier than it looked, dense at the center, but with a crust that had a different quality, almost architectural, the way a good loaf has structure in its skin. The color was a deep yellow that she associated viscerally and immediately with the bins of dried corn outside the agricultural supplier in Hamburg. Feed corn, the kind farmers bought to carry their pigs and cattle through winter. "Schweinebrot," said the woman across from her, a 40-year-old from Essen named Marta, and the table laughed the sharp collective laugh of people who have found a shared target for the tension they have been carrying for 19 days at sea. Ottilie set the cornbread down. She joined the laughter because it was easier than not joining it, and because the alternative, which was admitting that she had just examined that piece of bread with the professional attention she gave to anything baked by someone who knew what they were doing, was not something she was ready to say aloud. Not yet. What she had noticed in the few seconds she had held it was this: the crust was even. Not the artificial evenness of a mold, but the natural evenness of a skilled hand managing consistent heat. The interior visible, where Marta had broken her own portion in half and left it on the table, had a grain to it that was entirely its own, something that spoke of a specific technique and a specific ratio of ingredients arrived at through long repetition. Someone had made this bread many hundreds of times, perhaps thousands. She did not eat it. She ate the sweet potato and the beans and the biscuit, which she found unexpectedly good, flaky and faintly buttery. When the meal was over, she walked back to the workers' quarters and lay on her bunk in the heat and listened to the women in the adjacent bunks making quiet jokes about American food and what was waiting for them at home, and how long 3 years actually was when you counted the days. Hilda was on the bunk above her, writing something in the small journal she kept. After a while, she said softly in German, "The bread tonight, the yellow one." "What about it?" Ottilie said. "I almost tried it," Hilda said. "The smell was different than I expected." Ottilie said nothing. "Is that strange?" Hilda asked. "Go to sleep," Ottilie said. But Ottilie did not sleep easily herself that first night. She lay in the dark and thought about the satchel beside her, bunk, the jar inside it, the culture she had been keeping alive since Hamburg. She had drawn it from the bakehouse starter that Meisterbaum maintained for 40 years, the one that lived in a crock on the shelf above the proving table and gave every loaf its particular depth of flavor. He had spooned a portion into her jar the morning of her last day of work, before the wedding, before everything. She had kept it through Wilhelm's illness, through the funeral, Through the long winter of 1882, when the rent was due and the money was not there, she had kept it on the ship, feeding it with small handfuls of flour from a pouch she rationed carefully across the 19 days. It was not merely an ingredient. It was the continuous thread of her professional life, the living record of everything she knew how to do. In the morning, it would need feeding again. In the morning, there would be a new kitchen, a strange stove, and a woman who had not invited her there. She closed her eyes and let the Mississippi night press in around her, thick and warm and smelling of things she did not yet have names for. The following Sunday, 6 days after their arrival, Reverend Obadiah Gale came to the Whitmore estate. He was 60 years old, lean, with the weathered face of a man who had spent decades outdoors in Mississippi summers, and he carried himself with the particular gravity of someone who believed his presence in a room changed its moral atmosphere. He had been the pastor of the First Baptist Church of Clarksburg for 22 years. He had buried 11 young men from his congregation who did not return from the war, and he had spent the 20 years since trying to knit back together a community that grief and defeat had pulled apart at several seams. He did not dislike outsiders out of cruelty. He distrusted disruption out of experience. He had seen what happened to communities when the structures that held them were changed too quickly, and he had developed a settled conviction that the way things were done in this place and among these people had been earned through suffering and was therefore worth preserving. He gathered the women under the oak trees east of the main house for what Silas Whitmore described as a welcoming address. Hilda translated, standing just to Ottilie's left, her voice low and careful. The Reverend spoke about the nature of this community, about the obligations of hospitality and the obligations of those who receive it, about the importance of learning the customs of a place before presuming to alter them, about bread, which he used as a metaphor without apparently intending it as one. The bread of this land, he said, has been baked a certain way for a certain reason, and those who eat it would do well to understand what that reason is before they decide it should be done differently. Hilda translated this faithfully. Ottilie listened with her eyes on the middle distance. When the Reverend finished, she waited until he had moved away to speak with Silas, and then she said to Hilda quietly, "What is he actually saying?" Hilda considered. "He is saying that people who want to live here should live like the people here." "I have heard that before," Ottilie said, "in Hamburg, from men who did not want women in the baking guild." A few feet away, leaning against the fence with his arms crossed, Soren Whitmore heard the tail end of this exchange. He was 22 years old, Silas's eldest son, recently returned from a year at Vanderbilt University, where he had studied literature and economics and developed a habit of reading things that made his father uncomfortable at the dinner table. He had enough German to recognize what language it was, but not enough to follow it. He waited until Hilda turned, and then he said in English, slowly enough for Ottilie to follow, "Reverend Gale is a good man, but he sometimes confuses the order he prefers with the order God intended. They are not always the same thing." Hilda translated. Ottilie looked at the young man for a moment. He met her gaze without any of the performative discomfort she had noticed in other men on this property when they spoke to the German women. He was not what she would have expected from the son of a man like Silas Whitmore. There was something careful and observant in his bearing, the quality of someone who listens before deciding. "Who is he?" she asked Hilda. "The son," Hilda said. "Silas's son." Ottilie nodded slowly and said nothing more. But she noted the young man in the way she noted useful things, not warmly, not yet, but as a fact worth remembering. That afternoon, Sigrid Stern sought her out. Sigrid was 42 years old, broad through the shoulders, with a voice that carried across any room without effort. She had been the informal authority among the Bremen contingent of women long before they had left Hamburg Harbor. She had lost her husband in the same Ruhr collapse that took a dozen others, and she had decided in the months following that survival was not a moral category, but a practical one, and that the most practical thing any of them could do was maintain the identity that gave them coherence as a group. She found Ottilie near the storehouse examining the grounds and said without preamble, "They want us to disappear into this place." "No one has said that," Ottilie said. "Gale said it, in different words." Sigrid crossed her arms. "I know how that speech ends. I heard it from the company foreman in Bremen the month before the accident. Accept conditions, don't make trouble. This is how things work here." She paused. "We know how that story ends." Ottilie turned to look at her. "I know," she said, "but what are you proposing?" Sigrid said nothing for a moment. Then, "I am proposing we remember who we are, every day, deliberately. It was not an unreasonable position. Adelie understood the logic of it, but she also understood that logic and survival were not always the same discipline, and that 3 years was a long time to hold a position that the surrounding territory had already decided to erode. She said nothing more. She let Sigrid walk away, and she filed the conversation in the part of her mind where she kept things she would need to return to. 2 days later, Silas Whitmore summoned Adelie to his office. Soren sat in the corner of the room, which Adelie understood immediately was Silas's way of handling the language problem without having to acknowledge that he needed help. Soren translated sentence by sentence without editorializing. Silas was direct. The estate bakehouse oven had been broken since March. The repair contractor was not coming before September. He needed bread made for the main house. His property manager had confirmed that Adelie was a trained professional baker with 12 years of guild experience in Hamburg. He wanted her to use the main kitchen, the one operated by Vesta Hayes, to produce bread for the family table each morning. Adelie listened to all of this. Then she asked through Soren, "Does Mrs. Hayes know about this arrangement?" Silas looked at her steadily. "Not yet." "Has she been consulted?" "She works for me," Silas said. "The kitchen is my kitchen." Adelie absorbed this. It was factually true and practically useless. A kitchen is only as functional as the person who knows it, and the person who knew the kitchen was Vesta Hayes, who had made it clear from the first evening that she had noticed Adelie and had decided without any discussion that Adelie was a category of problem she had not yet classified. "I understand," Adelie said. Soren translated. Silas nodded, produced a handwritten note authorizing Adelie's use of the kitchen, and handed it to her. The interview was over. Adelie walked out into the yard. The afternoon light was cutting sideways through the oak trees. She stood in the middle of the dirt yard and looked at the cookhouse. Smoke from the chimney, the sound of something being chopped rhythmically on a heavy board, and faintly a sound she had to listen for Vesta Hayes singing to herself a slow melody in a minor key that Adelie did not recognize, but that had in it the quality of something old and worked over a song that had been sung enough times to settle into the bones of the person singing it. She held the note in her hand. It was a piece of paper that gave her permission to be somewhere she had not been invited. She had spent enough of her life holding pieces of paper that gave her theoretical permission for things that were practically complicated to know the difference between a document and a solution. Hilda appeared at her shoulder. "Do you want me to come with you?" "No," Adelie said. "This is between two people who know what a kitchen is." She walked to the cookhouse door. She raised her hand, and she knocked, which was not what you did if you owned the place, and exactly what you did if you understood what you were walking into. The door opened. Vesta Hayes looked at her, then at the note in her hand. She took it, read it, folded it, handed it back. "Left corner," Vesta said. "Old stove, coal in the bin by the window. Don't touch my cast iron." She turned back to her work. Adelie stepped inside. The room was warm and smelled of rendered fat and dried herbs hanging from the rafters, and something deeper, the particular mineral smell of cast iron that has been in continuous use for decades. She found the old stove in the left corner, smaller than Vesta's main range, its surface slightly rusted but functional. She opened the coal bin. She set her satchel on the table beside it and began arranging her materials with the methodical calm of someone who has set up a workspace in unfamiliar conditions before and knows the first thing to do is establish what you have. 2 women, 1 kitchen. The distance between their workstations was perhaps 12 feet. Neither of them spoke. The sound of cooking filled the room between them, the rhythms different, the purposes different, the techniques drawing from 2 separate lineages of knowledge that had never in all of history been asked to share a single fire. Vesta worked. Adelie worked. Outside, the Mississippi summer pressed against the windows. Inside, 2 kinds of bread were coming into being in the same air, and neither woman was ready yet to acknowledge that the other one knew what she was doing. But Adelie had seen Vesta's hands move over the cast iron with the certainty of long practice, and she had recognized what she was watching. Not luck, not habit, craft. The same thing she had spent 12 years building in Hamburg applied to a different grain on a different continent and just as real as anything she had learned from Meister Baum. She did not say this. She went back to her dough. At the end of that first afternoon when she was gathering her things to leave, she noticed something on the table beside her stove. A small piece of clean cloth folded twice. She had not put it there. She looked across the kitchen. Vesta was at the far end, her back turned washing a pot with the focused efficiency of someone who had decided the workday was over. Ottilie looked at the cloth again. Her glass jar of sourdough starter had been sitting on the windowsill that morning, exposed to the crosswind from the south that moved through the Mississippi Valley on summer afternoons. The cloth was exactly the right size to wrap around it and block that wind. She picked it up, held it for a moment. The gesture it represented was not friendship. It was not welcome. It was something more precise and more interesting than either of those things. It was one professional acknowledging without words and without any reduction of her own position that she had noticed something about another professional's materials and had acted accordingly. Nothing more, nothing less. She put the cloth in her satchel and walked back to the workers' quarters in the long amber light of the Mississippi evening. The smell of cornbread still hung in the air behind her, faint and persistent, following her farther than she expected it to. The jar almost died on the fourth morning. Ottilie came into the cookhouse before sunrise when the sky outside the single east-facing window was still the color of iron, and found her sourdough starter sitting on the open windowsill. The night had been warm and humid, but a wind had come through from the sill sometime after midnight, the kind of wet, searching wind that finds every gap in every wall, and it had been blowing directly across that jar for at least 4 hours. She crossed the kitchen in 4 steps and picked it up, held it to the gray light. The culture inside was still alive, but stressed, the surface dried at the edges. The color shifted from the healthy cream she maintained through careful feeding towards something thinner and more uncertain. She pressed her thumb against the wax seal, checked the temperature of the glass against her cheek. It had not died, but it had been weakened, and correcting it would cost 3 days. She stood there for a moment with the jar in both hands. Then she turned around. Vesta Hayes was at the main range, her back to the room, lifting the iron lid on the firebox with a practiced hook and checking the coals. She had been there before Ottilie arrived. She was always there before Ottilie arrived. Ottilie set the jar on her own table with a sound just deliberate enough to carry across the kitchen. Not a slam, a placement. The sound of a statement made without words. "That jar needs to stay off the window," she said. Her English came out careful and flat, stripped of inflection by concentration. "Every time, this is not negotiable." Vesta did not turn around. She set the lid back on the firebox. "My kitchen, my window, my air." The silence that followed was not empty. It was the kind of silence that has weight and direction, the kind two people generate when they have each decided that what they just said is true and that neither of them intends to unsay it. Ottilie did not respond with argument. She wrapped the jar in the cloth Vesta had left her 3 days earlier, set it in the warmest corner of her stove shelf, and began the patient work of nursing the culture back. She would feed it twice that day. She would lose a morning's production. The bread for Silas Whitmore's breakfast table would be simpler than she had planned. This was the cost of the window. Both of them understood it without discussing it, and the understanding sat between them like a third person in the room for the rest of the day. What Ottilie could not determine, and what kept her turning the question over during the long hours of that morning, was whether the jar had been moved deliberately. Vesta was precise about the kitchen. She noticed everything. A woman who had managed this space for 18 years did not fail to notice a glass jar on a windowsill that had not been there the day before. But noticing something and moving it were different acts, and the distance between them said something about intent that Ottilie was not yet ready to assign. She thought about this the way she thought about dough. You could not force it to tell you what it was. You could only create the right conditions and wait. That evening in the workers' quarters, Hilda found Ottilie sitting on her bunk in the early dark, the green notebook open on her knee. She was not writing. She was looking at the page with the unfocused attention of someone thinking about something the page could not contain. "The jar again," Hilda said. "The jar," Ottilie confirmed. Hilda sat down on the bunk across from her. She was quiet for a moment, the way she had learned to be quiet around Ottilie, not filling the space but leaving it open. Then she said, "I ate the cornbread again today. At lunch. I did not hide it this time. I just ate it." Ottilie looked up. "Sigrid saw me," Hilda said. There was something careful in her voice, a precision that meant she was measuring the effect of her words. She did not say anything, but she looked at me the way she looks at things she has decided are problems she will deal with later. Ottilie closed the notebook. "How long have you been eating it?" "Since the second day," Hilda said. She met Ottilie's eyes without apology. It is not what I expected. There is something in it. I do not have a word for it in German. It is not sweet and not savory exactly. It is both, and neither one overcomes the other. She paused. I wrote to my mother about it. What did you tell her? That it was better than I thought. That she should not tell anyone. A small pause. She probably told everyone. Ottilie looked at this notebook in her hands for a long moment. Go to sleep, Hilda, she said finally. Hilda climbed to her bunk. Within a few minutes, her breathing changed into the slow rhythm of sleep, that easy surrender that came naturally to the young, and that Ottilie had not experienced uninterrupted since the winter Wilhelm died. She lay in the dark and thought about the jar now recovering on the shelf of the corner stove. She thought about Vesta Hayes' back always turned, always working, always positioned at an angle that said, I am aware of you, but I am choosing not to engage. She thought about what it meant that Vesta had left the cloth, and what it meant that Vesta had also allowed the jar to sit on the windowsill, and whether those two acts could coexist in the same person, which they clearly could, because all people were more than one thing at a time, particularly people under pressure. She understood the pressure. She was living inside it herself. 3 days after the incident with the jar, Sigrid Stern made her larger move. She did it quietly the way Sigrid did most things. She went to Hilda first, finding her at the well away from the main yard. You are eating their food, Sigrid said, not a question. Hilda was filling a water bucket. She did not stop. I am eating the food that is provided to us. The cornbread specifically. Among other things, yes. Sigrid was quiet for a moment. The well rope creaked in the heat. In the distance, someone was hammering in the barn. The women are watching you, Sigrid said finally. You know that. I know, Hilda said. She set down the full bucket and looked at Sigrid directly, which was something not everyone did. Sigrid, we are going to be here for 3 years. What is the plan? We eat around the cornbread at every meal for 3 years and send a message to people who are not watching. The message, Sigrid said, is for ourselves. Hilda picked up the bucket. I think we have different ideas about what it means to keep yourself intact. She walked back toward the workers' quarters without looking back. Sigrid stood by the well for a long moment. Then she went to find 4 other women she trusted and told them that Hilda Brandt was drifting and that someone needed to watch what Ottilie Hoffman was doing in that American kitchen, because the direction it was heading was not going to end with them leaving Mississippi the same people they had arrived as. That evening she came to Ottilie directly. She found her returning from the cookhouse, flour dust still on her apron, moving through the long, amber light of the yard. I want to know your intentions, Sigrid said. There was nothing aggressive in her voice. This was the tone of someone conducting a necessary interview. My intention, Ottilie said, is to do my work and send money home to my daughter. And the American kitchen is where my work currently takes place. Ottilie stopped walking. She looked at Sigrid with the patience of someone who has had this conversation before in different words, in different rooms. Sigrid, I bake bread. It is what I know how to do. I am doing it in an unfamiliar kitchen with unfamiliar materials, and I am trying to do it well because that is the only way I know how to do anything. She paused. What exactly is the danger you are watching for? Sigrid was quiet for a long moment. The danger, she said finally, is that we forget we came here for a reason and stay for a different one. That we become something we did not agree to become. It was not an unreasonable fear. Ottilie acknowledged it internally and then said, when that starts to happen, I will tell you myself. This was enough for that evening. But both women understood the conversation was not finished. Eugenia Whitmore came into the cookhouse on the 9th day of Ottilie's presence there in the mid-morning, when the breakfast service was finished and the room was in the deliberate quiet of preparation for the midday meal. She had been informed of the situation with the kitchen by Silas in broad strokes, and she had decided to inspect it herself in the way that she inspected all things on the estate that she had not personally authorized. She was wearing a cream-colored dress with a high collar, appropriate for the performance of authority, and she moved through the cookhouse door with the proprietary ease of someone entering a room that has always belonged to her family. Vesta straightened almost imperceptibly when Eugenia came in. Not quite a flinch. The long, practiced adjustment of someone who has understood for years the particular physics of this woman's presence in a room. Eugenia looked around the kitchen. Her eyes moved over Vesta's workspace with the familiarity of long acquaintance, then stopped at the left corner, where Ottilie's stove and work table occupied their allotted 12 feet. She walked over, looked at the small stack of loaves wrapped in cloth on the shelf, picked one up. unwrapped it, examined the crust dark and even the hallmark of proper rye, cut a slice with the knife from Audley's block, tasted it. The expression that crossed her face was not disgust. It was something more controlled than disgust, the careful neutrality of a person who has tasted something unexpected and is deciding how to characterize it. Sour, she said. She set the slice down. The people in this house do not eat sour bread in the morning. Audley had been watching from across the kitchen. Her English was sufficient for this exchange, and she chose not to route it through Hilda, who was not present anyway. She kept her voice level. The sour is from the living yeast, Mrs. Whitmore. It keeps the bread sound for 1 week. In the heat of Mississippi summer, a loaf that holds is worth more than a loaf that is pleasant for 1 day and mulled by the third. The room was very quiet. Vesta at her range had stopped moving. Eugenia knew this was correct. She had lost 2 batches of bread the previous July, when a stretch of especially humid weather had moved through, and she had said at the time that someone needed to find a solution to the problem of summer bread. She had said it to Silas, who had nodded and done nothing. She had said it to Vesta, who had tried a new method that helped somewhat. The woman standing across this kitchen in a gray work dress, who had been in this country for 9 days, had just provided that solution in 1 sentence. Eugenia Whitmore recognized this. She also recognized that acknowledging it was a thing she was not equipped to do this morning in front of Vesta, in front of this stranger who had been installed in her cook's kitchen without her consent. She turned to Vesta. Her voice was even and final. Vesta, starting next week, the morning bread is yours again, not the German woman's. Vesta met her eyes and said, "Yes, ma'am." Eugenia set down the slice and walked out of the cookhouse without looking at Audley again. The kitchen was silent for a long moment. Audley stood at her work table and looked at the half slice of her bread sitting on the cutting board where Eugenia had left it. Vesta stood at her range and did not move. Then slowly she picked up her spoon and went back to the pot she had been tending. Audley watched her. Something in the set of Vesta's shoulders was different from its usual quality. Tighter, the posture of someone who has just been handed a weapon they did not ask for and do not want to carry. Audley understood this precisely. Eugenia had just told Vesta that her competence was sufficient to make a German professional unnecessary. This should have been, from any conventional angle, a victory for Vesta, but it was not a victory Vesta had sought. It had been delivered to her like an instruction, which meant it was not really hers at all. It was Eugenia's. Vesta had simply been assigned the role of the instrument. Clara said nothing. She rewrapped her bread, washed her hands, and began preparing for the next day's work. That evening, when Hattie had gone home and the cookhouse held only the settling sounds of cooling iron and the first cricket noise of evening, Vesta was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee when Audley came back in. Not for any ingredient. She came back in because there was something that needed to be said and could only be said here in this room without an audience. She sat down across from Vesta. The lamp between them gave off a low, steady light. "Your bread is made with craft," Audley said. "I have been watching you for 9 days, and I want you to know that I have seen that. It is not a compliment from a stranger. It is an assessment from someone who knows what the craft looks like when it is real." Vesta looked at her for a long moment. The expression on her face was one Audley could not fully read, which told her it was complex, which meant it was real. Finally, Vesta said, "You think that fixes anything?" "No," Audley said. "Nothing is fixed, but I wanted you to know I see what you are doing in this kitchen. Before anything else happens, I wanted that to be said." She rose. Vesta sat with her coffee and the dying lamp and the words still in the air of the room. After a long while, she reached across the table and moved the lamp to the windowsill, and in its new position the light fell differently, throwing the kitchen into a different kind of shadow, warmer and less divided, as though the room had shifted something in itself. She sat for a long time more. The fire ticked in the firebox. The Mississippi night pressed at the windows. And Vesta Hayes thought about what it meant that the only person on this property who had ever said those particular words to her was a woman who had crossed an ocean and been handed a corner stove and had nevertheless looked up from her own work and seen. The letter from Silas Whitmore arrived on Audley's work table the following Monday morning, written in his dense, slanting hand and left there before she arrived. It was not a summons exactly. It was a description of a situation and its available resolutions. Soren was present when Audley read it, standing near the door, and he translated the sections her English could not carry. Silas had attended a meeting at the First Baptist Church in Clarksburg the previous Friday evening. Reverend Obadiah Gale had organized it. Present were 14 men of local standing: farmers, the mill owner, 2 merchants, the county clerk. The subject was the arrangement at Whitmore Estate, specifically the matter of foreign contract workers receiving wages that exceeded the local standard. Gale had made his case in the measured, principled language he used for everything. He was not speaking from prejudice, he said. He was speaking from a concern for order. When those who came from outside a community began altering the fundamental practices of that community, the harm was not always visible immediately, but it was real. He had used Silas wrote the bread in the Whitmore kitchen as his example. The changes happening there were small, he had said, but small changes in foundational things were how communities lost themselves. Soren had been at the meeting. He had stood up, which Silas noted in the letter with what Ottilie recognized as the careful neutrality of a man who had not yet decided how he felt about what his son had done. Soren had said that a loaf of bread was a loaf of bread regardless of where the hands that made it had been born, and that the community was better served by good bread than by the consistent production of inferior bread in defense of local pride. There had been silence after this. Then Gale had looked at Silas and waited. Silas had said nothing. He had come home and written this letter. At the bottom were 2 paragraphs. The first said that he could not sustain the contracts for 34 women against continued community pressure. Gale had influence that extended beyond the church into the county apparatus, into the relationships that governed how business was done in Clarksburg. Silas could resist him once, not indefinitely. The second paragraph was the one Soren translated with the most care. Christmas was 6 weeks away. Silas was hosting the annual estate dinner, which included the household staff, the field workers, the family and guests from Clarksburg, among them Reverend Gale. He wanted the dinner to be notable. He wanted the bread specifically to be something that people would remember. He was asking Ottilie and Vesta Hayes to prepare it together. If the dinner was received well, Silas would use his standing to advocate formally for the renewal of all 34 contracts. If the dinner was not received well, or if the arrangement collapsed before it happened, the contracts would not be renewed. 6 weeks, 1 dinner, 34 people's futures balanced on a table in Clarksburg, Mississippi. Soren folded the letter and set it on the table. He looked at Ottilie. "He is not an easy man," Soren said, "but he means what he writes." Ottilie stood still for a moment. Then she asked, "Did you mean what you said to Reverend Gale at that meeting?" Soren met her eyes. There was nothing performative in his expression. Just a person who had said a true thing and was living with the weight of it. "I did," he said. "Your father did not support you." Soren's jaw moved slightly. Not a smile. Something more complicated. "Not yet," he said. He left. Ottilie stood alone in the corner of the cookhouse with the letter in her hand and the knowledge of what she now needed to do pressing down on her with the steady weight of something that could not be postponed. She needed to tell Sigrid before anyone else. That was the first and most difficult step. Sigrid, who had already decided that Ottilie's presence in this kitchen was a kind of surrender. Sigrid, who had watched Hilda eat cornbread and cataloged it as a warning sign that was now extending into something she could no longer dismiss as one young woman's weakness. She folded the letter, put it in her apron pocket, walked out into the hard afternoon light. Sigrid was on the worker's porch mending a work shirt with the mechanical regularity of someone whose hands can work while her mind is fully occupied elsewhere. She looked up when Ottilie came toward her and read her face before a word was spoken. "Sit down," Ottilie said. Not a request. Sigrid sat. Ottilie told her everything. The meeting, Gale, Silas's letter, the dinner, the contracts. She told it straight without softening. Sigrid sat through all of it without moving, which meant she was furious, because Sigrid moved constantly when she was merely annoyed and went very still when the stakes were real. When Ottilie finished, Sigrid said, "He is using 34 women as leverage for a dinner party." "He is using 34 women as leverage," Ottilie agreed. "The dinner is the mechanism. The question is whether we use it or not." "We? You mean you and the American cook?" "I mean all of us. And Vesta Hayes, yes." Sigrid set down the shirt. She looked at Ottilie with the focused attention of someone deciding something important. "And if we do this and it fails, if Gale decides the bread was not good enough and says so publicly to the men who hold influence in this county, then we came to Mississippi, work 6 months without pay, and go home in the spring." which is worse than what we hoped for, but better than nothing. And if we do not try, same result earlier. The silence between them had the quality of mathematics, two people arriving at the same conclusion from different directions, and neither of them happy about it. Sigrid picked up the shirt again. Her needle went into the fabric. "If the dinner fails," she said quietly, "I will be the first one to say I told you so." "I know," Ottilie said. "And if it succeeds," Sigrid said without looking up, "I will not say anything at all." This was Ottilie understood as close to permission as Sigrid Stern was capable of giving. It was enough. She walked back to the cookhouse. Vesta was at the range as always. The smell in the room was the accumulated smell of a day's work. Ottilie crossed the kitchen and stood at Vesta's shoulder, not beside her, slightly behind which was the position of someone who was asking to be heard rather than confronted. Vesta felt this. She did not turn around for a long moment. Then she did. Ottilie said, "I needed to talk to you not about the jar and not about Mrs. Whitmore, about a dinner in 6 weeks that 34 people's contracts depend on. And I need to ask you, not because Silas Whitmore told me to ask, but because you are the best cook in this county and I am not foolish enough to try to do this without you." Vesta looked at her for a long time. The lamp above the range caught the lines at the corners of her eyes, the particular depth of fatigue and vigilance that comes from decades of being the most capable person in a room while occupying the least powerful position in it. "You think saying that changes anything?" Vesta asked. "No," Ottilie said. "But it is true, and I wanted it said before we decided anything else." Vesta turned back to her range. She was quiet long enough that Ottilie thought the conversation was over. Then Vesta said without turning, 6 weeks. 6 weeks, Ottilie confirmed. Another silence. The fire ticked in the firebox. Something in the pot began to simmer. Vesta reached for the long spoon. "Sit down," she said, "and start talking." Ottilie pulled a stool to the edge of Vesta's workspace and sat. For the first time since she had walked into this cookhouse 12 days ago, she was sitting in Vesta's half of the kitchen. Vesta did not acknowledge this. She just kept working, her back partly turned, her hands moving, with the unvarying assurance of long practice. But she was listening. The quality of the silence made that clear. Outside, the sun was going down behind the long tree line, and the evening air was moving through the yard, and somewhere in the fields beyond the barn, a night bird was calling into the last gray light. 6 weeks, 1 dinner, 2 women who were not friends, and perhaps 34 futures that depended on whether what they could make together was worth more than what they had each been making alone. On Ottilie's work table, wrapped in cloth in the warmest corner of the old stove shelf, the jar of sourdough starter that had almost died 4 days ago was quietly, stubbornly coming back to life. In the 2 weeks that followed their agreement, they made the hybrid loaf twice. Both versions were unfinished things, instructive failures that told Ottilie what the formula still needed. The first was too dense, the corn overwhelming the rye culture's lift. The second was better but lacked depth of flavor. She adjusted the ratios. She thought about what was missing. The answer came from an unexpected direction. The first morning, they worked openly toward the same purpose. Neither of them mentioned the shift. Ottilie arrived before sunrise as she always did, and Vesta was already there as she always was. But the angle had changed. Not toward each other, not yet, but away from the adversarial geometry that had organized the room since the first day. They were pointed now in roughly the same direction. That was enough to begin with. Ottilie set out her materials on her side of the kitchen. Flour. The starter fully recovered now and active again, its surface domed and lively in the way that rewarded patient care. The cloth bundle of caraway. A small crock of dark molasses she had asked Soren Whitmore to procure from the estate stores because she had been thinking about the sweetness problem and had arrived at an answer that the Mississippi pantry could actually provide. Vesta watched the molasses come out of the satchel without saying anything. She turned back to her own preparations. An hour passed, too, the kitchen filled with the sounds of work, the scrape of the bench scraper, the hiss of fat in the pan, the low knock of dough against the board. The October light 6 weeks before Christmas came through the east window and moved slowly across the floor in a long rectangle that reached Ottilie's work table by mid-morning. It was Vesta who broke the silence first. Not with words, she set a small bowl of sorghum syrup on the work table between them, equidistant from both their stations, without looking at Ottilie, without offering explanation. Then she went back to her range. Ottilie looked at the bowl. She picked it up. She added a measured spoonful to the hybrid batter she had been developing. She stirred it in. The color of the batter deepened slightly, and the smell in her corner of the kitchen changed the corn and rye, given a new undertone, something dark and mineral and southern that had been missing from both previous versions. She did not thank Vesta, not because she was ungrateful, but because she understood that what Vesta had done was not an act of generosity in the conventional sense. It was an act of professional contribution offered in the language of the kitchen rather than the language of speech, and to translate it into words would have diminished it. Vesta understood this too. They were, it turned out, fluent in the same dialect even if they could not yet speak each other's languages. They worked like that for the rest of the morning. Each woman in her own domain making her own things, but occasionally wordlessly a tool was passed, or an ingredient shared, or a problem solved with the gesture that crossed the 12 feet between them. By midday, something had changed in the room that Ottilie could not have described precisely, but that she felt with the same certainty with which she felt dough that had reached the right temperature. The adversarial quality was gone. In its place was something more complex and more durable, the wary respect of two craftspeople who had spent enough time watching each other to know that the other one was real. The third version of the hybrid loaf came out of the oven at mid-afternoon. The crust had the color of good cornbread, but with a structural integrity capable of being sliced thin without crumbling. The molasses and sorghum together had darkened the crumb and added a depth that the previous versions had lacked. The caraway was present, but not dominant, a thread running through the flavor rather than a declaration. Ottilie cut 2 slices. She carried one to Vesta's end of the kitchen and set it on the board beside her range. Then she went back and ate her own slice standing at her work table. Vesta looked at the slice, then she picked it up and bit into it. She chewed slowly the way a professional eats something they are evaluating rather than merely consuming. Ottilie did not watch her. She looked at her own slice and ate. The sorghum, Vesta said after a long moment. That was the piece it needed. Yes, Ottilie said, and I would not have thought of it without seeing your pantry. Vesta said nothing more, but she finished the slice. That evening, Ottilie had the harder conversation. She walked to the workers' quarters in the house light and found Sigrid on the porch. But the mending was put away, and Sigrid was simply sitting with her hands in her lap, looking at the dark fields. This was unusual enough that Ottilie stopped at the bottom of the porch steps. I heard about the meeting, Sigrid said before Ottilie could speak. She did not specify which meeting. She meant all of it. The workers' quarters had its own information network, and Ottilie had long since stopped being surprised by what moved through it. Then you know what I came to say, Ottilie said. I know what you came to ask, Sigrid said. The distinction was precise and intentional. Ottilie climbed the 2 steps and sat down in the other chair. For a moment, they were just 2 women from northern Germany, sitting on a porch in Mississippi, while the light went out of the sky and the frogs started up in the drainage ditch beyond the barn. 34 people, Ottilie said. I can count, Sigrid said. I am not asking you to like it, Ottilie said. I am not asking you to change your mind about any of it. I am asking you to let it happen and not stand in the way. Sigrid was quiet for a long time. A wagon passed on the road beyond the oak trees, its lantern making a slow orange arc through the dark. My husband, she said finally, died because a foreman decided that the safety procedure was too slow and the coal needed to come out faster. One man's judgment about efficiency cost 31 men their lives. She paused. I have very little patience for people who tell others that they should accept conditions that serve someone else's convenience. Silas Whitmore is not a foreman cutting safety corners, Ottilie said. He is a man caught between competing pressures and trying to find a way through that does the least damage. He holds our contracts, Sigrid said. That makes him the one with the power. The fact that he is not using it cruelly does not make him our ally. No, Ottilie agreed, but it makes this dinner possible. And the dinner is what we have. Another silence. Longer this time. Then Sigrid said with the directness that was her only register, What do you need from me? Ottilie had been prepared for resistance. The question asked plainly surprised her. She took a moment before answering. I need you not to convince the others that participating in the dinner is a betrayal. That is all. You do not have to help. You do not have to come. You just cannot be the voice that tells them it is wrong to treat them. Sigrid looked at the dark fields. If the dinner fails, she said, I will say I told you so. I know. And if it succeeds, she said, her voice dropping to something quieter, I will not say anything at all. She picked up the work shirt she had set aside and held it in her lap without beginning to mend it. That was the whole of the conversation. It was enough. 2 weeks before Christmas, Eugenia Whitmore came into the cookhouse at night. Ottilie was alone. Vesta had gone for the evening. Hattie had long since left. The kitchen was in the quiet post-production state that Ottilie had come to value the surfaces, wipe down the tools, put away the banked coals in the firebox, ticking softly as they cooled. She was working through a problem with the Christmas loaf by doing what she always did with problems she could not solve, directly working around them, with her hands practicing the folding technique on a test portion of dough, while her mind worked at the real question from an angle. The door opened. Eugenia came in. She was not dressed for a confrontation. She was in a plain house dress, her hair down, and there was something different about the way she moved through the doorway without the territorial certainty that usually preceded her. She looked, Ottilie thought, like a woman who had been awake for some time. Eugenia sat down at the kitchen table in the chair that Vesta sometimes used for her end-of-day coffee. She did not ask permission to sit, but she did not have the usual quality of ownership in the gesture either. She simply sat because she was tired and the chair was there. Ottilie kept working. She did not stop and she did not make a production of continuing. She just worked because the dough needed working. And because she had found in her years as a professional baker that some conversations could only happen in the presence of useful activity when neither person was required to hold the other's gaze and the hands had something to do besides clench. After a while, Eugenia said, My mother died the year I turned 12. Ottilie's hands slowed slightly, not enough to be visible, but enough for her to feel. She made ginger cake every Christmas, Eugenia said, from the day after Thanksgiving until Christmas Eve. The house smelled like it for 3 weeks. Ginger and clove and something else I could never identify. She never wrote the recipe down. She said good recipes lived in the hands, not on paper. She paused. I have tried to make it every Christmas for 36 years. It is never right. Ottilie set down the dough. She wiped her hands on her apron. I thought you should know, Eugenia said, that I understand there is skill in what you do. I understood it when I tasted the bread that morning. I said what I said because it was convenient to say it. Her voice was even and controlled, the voice of a woman who had learned to manage her emotions in public with the same precision she managed the estate ledgers. But underneath the control, there was something unsteady. I am not accustomed to apologizing, she said. I want to be clear that this is an attempt at it, even if it does not look like one. Ottilie crossed the kitchen to her work table. She opened the green notebook, the one that had belonged to Meister Baum, and turned to the last section pages she had not opened since Hamburg. There in his dense and careful hand was a recipe for Lebkuchen, the traditional German festival ginger cake, with its long list of spices and its particular technique for the honey glaze that made the surface shine. She had never made it in Mississippi. She had not thought there would be an occasion. She brought the notebook to the table and set it open before Eugenia. Eugenia looked at the page. The handwriting meant nothing to her. The language meant nothing to her. But she looked at it for a long time, her eyes moving over the shapes of the letters, the way a person looks at something they cannot read but recognize as carrying weight. Then she looked up at Ottilie, and her expression did something that Ottilie had not expected and would not forget. It opened, just for a moment, and then it closed again. But in that moment, Eugenia Whitmore was not the woman who ran this estate with a cool and capable hand. She was a 12-year-old girl who had lost her mother before Christmas and had been trying to reconstruct something irretrievable ever since. Ottilie sat down beside her, not across from her, but beside her, and began to read the recipe aloud in German slowly while her finger moved along under each ingredient. Then she reached for a piece of paper from the shelf above the table and wrote each ingredient again in English, beneath the German, with the quantities converted from German measures to the cups and spoons of an American kitchen. They sat like that for nearly an hour. Eugenia watching, Ottilie translating, the kitchen quiet around them except for the sound of the coals and the occasional night sound coming through the window. At some point, Ottilie rose and found the spices on Vesta's shelf, the ones that were also in the Lebkuchen recipe, and she opened them one by one and set them on the table between them. And Eugenia leaned over each jar and breathed in, not saying anything, just breathing as though she were looking for something in the smell that words could not locate. When Ottilie finally closed the notebook, Eugenia sat quietly for a moment. Then she said, "I will tell Silas you need whatever you need for the dinner." She rose. She moved toward the door with something restored in her carriage, the self-possession back in place. At the door, she stopped and said without turning, "The bread you make, the one that is neither German nor mine, it should be on the table at Christmas." Then she was gone. Ottilie sat alone in the kitchen for a long time. The notebook in front of her, the spice jars still open on the table, the air carrying the combined fragrance of ginger and clove, and caraway, three different traditions of warmth occupying the same air, without any of them canceling the others out. In the morning, she told Vesta about the ginger cake. Vesta listened without expression while she poured the first coffee of the day. When Ottilie finished, Vesta said, "I know about Mrs. Eugenia and the cake. I have known about it since the first Christmas I cooked in this house." She set the coffee pot down. "I could not give her what she wanted. The spices were right. The method was right, but I did not have the original. You do." "Baum's recipe may not be her mother's recipe," Ottilie said. "No," Vesta said, "but it is a real one, made the way her mother's was made by someone who was taught properly. That is close enough." She paused. Sometimes close enough is what people need. They began that morning to what would occupy them for the next 12 days. Not a collaboration in the formal sense, no discussion of hierarchy or territory or who was responsible for what outcome. Simply two professional cooks working toward a specific meal, each contributing what she knew best, each filling in the gaps the other's knowledge could not reach. Vesta taught Ottilie the estate's particular Christmas traditions, the dishes that had been on the Whitmore table since before the war, the recipes the family would notice by their absence. Ottilie brought to the common project the precision of her guild training and the flexibility she had developed in the weeks of working around the limitations of an unfamiliar kitchen. They tested things. Some failed, some worked immediately. The hybrid loaf was made twice more, each version refined until it was consistent enough to produce reliably under the pressure of a large service. Soren appeared in the kitchen doorway one afternoon with a small sack he set on the end of the work table without a word. Ottilie opened it. Dried caraway seeds, a full pound of them, sourced from a spice merchant in Mobile who had apparently been written to by someone willing to pay the freight cost. She looked up. Soren was already walking away. She set the caraway on the shelf and went back to work. Later that day, she saw Vesta look at the caraway on the shelf and then look at the doorway where Soren had stood, and something in Vesta's expression shifted slightly, a small acknowledgement of an unexpected act. The night before Christmas Eve, Hattie was pressing the last of the table linens, and Hilda was helping string pine boughs along the dining hall windows, a task she had volunteered for with the genuine enthusiasm of someone who had decided to be present for what was happening rather than observe it from a cautious distance. Sigrid was in the workers' quarters. She had not helped with any of the preparation. She had also not said a word against it since the conversation on the porch, and for Sigrid Stern, that silence was a form of active support that cost her something real. Ottilie made the ginger cake that evening alone after Vesta had gone. She worked from Baum's recipe adjusted for the Mississippi pantry molasses, standing in for some of the German dark sugar local honey used for the glaze. The kitchen filled with a smell she had not expected to produce in this country, the deep, sweet, spiced warmth of a Northern European winter kitchen transposed into a Southern American cookhouse, incongruous and entirely real at once. She left two of the small cakes on the main house porch wrapped in cloth before she went to bed. She did not knock. She did not leave a note. She simply left them there in the cold December night for whoever came to the door in the morning to find. Christmas Eve arrived clear and cold by Mississippi standards, the temperature dropping into the 40s after sunset and the first hard stars of winter appearing in a sky washed clean by a brief afternoon rain. The dining hall was lit with oil lamps, and the two good chandeliers brought out only for the estate's formal occasions, and the tables were set with the Whitmore linens and the formal china that had survived the war in a trunk under the back bedroom floorboards. The guests from Clarksburg arrived by wagon and on horseback, their breath visible in the cold air, their voices carrying the particular brightness of people who have set aside their ordinary troubles for one evening. Reverend Obadiah Gale came with his wife Helen, a quiet woman who looked at everything with the careful attention of someone who had long served as the witness to her husband's public life. Silas stood at the entrance and received them with the composed authority of a man who has chosen for this evening to be the person he knows how to be. He shook hands. He introduced Soren, who had dressed for the occasion and stood straight and managed to be courteous to Reverend Gale in a way that contained no apology for what he had said at the church meeting. Eugenia stood beside Silas and wore the composed expression she wore for all public occasions. But when she caught Adelai's eye across the room briefly, something passed between them that was not a smile and not a formal acknowledgement, but that carried the memory of two women sitting at a kitchen table late at night with a recipe written in a language one of them could not read. The food came out in the order Vesta had determined, and the service moved with the efficiency of 18 years of practice. The workers and field hands ate at the long tables in the outer room. The family and town guests ate in the inner room, which opened through wide double doors, so the whole gathering occupied the same building, the same warmth, the same evening. The bread came out with the main course. Three kinds as they had planned. Vesta's cornbread, golden and correct, and as familiar to the family as their own names. Adelai's rye, the formal version made for occasions with the deep crust and the caraway. And the third loaf, the one with no name, the one that had been made from necessity and refined through 2 months of shared work, set in the center of the table in its final form. Reverend Powell sat at the head of the guest table. He took the cornbread first, then the rye. He tasted each, nodded, made the small sounds of someone confirming that the food before him met a reasonable standard. Then he looked at the loaf in the center of the table. He cut himself a slice. He tasted it. The table around him continued its conversations. Forks moved. Wine was poured. Soren at the far end of the table watched Gale in his peripheral vision without appearing to. Gale chewed. He set down his fork. He looked at the loaf for a moment with the expression of a man who has encountered something that does not fit the categories he has been using. Then he turned to Silas. "Who made this one?" he asked. Silas looked toward the doorway to the kitchen wing where Vesta and Adelie were both visible, standing near the door watching the service. He gestured toward them. Gale looked. He saw the two women standing side by side in the doorway, a thing he had perhaps not expected to see. He looked back at the loaf. He looked at Silas. "Good bread," he said. The words were simple, and they were not everything. They did not undo what he had said at the church meeting, and they did not change the position he held in this community. But they were true, and they were said in public and in the hearing of the people at his table, and in a room like this one, in a county like this one, in a year like 1885, that was not nothing. I do not know what else to call it. It is just good bread. Silas looked at his wine. "That is generally enough," he said. Across the room at the long workers' table, Hilda was sitting between Hattie and one of the field workers' wives and had been for the last 20 minutes explaining in her careful assembled English how the caraway in the bread was grown and dried and what it tasted like when it was fresh in Hamburg in the autumn. The field worker's wife was nodding with the expression of someone genuinely interested in knowing a thing they had never thought to wonder about before. Soren had left his seat and was standing near the workers' tables doing what Adelie had noticed he always did at gatherings, listening more than he spoke, watching how people occupied the same space without necessarily occupying the same conversation. He caught Hilda's eye at some point, and she said something in English that made him laugh, a real laugh, unguarded, the first time Adelie had heard it in the 2 months she had been at Whitmore Estate. Silas found Soren near the end of the evening when the guests were gathering their coats and the conversations were becoming the shorter, warmer kind that happened at the end of good evenings. He put his hand on his son's shoulder. Not a clap, not the hearty gesture of men who use touch to establish authority. Just a hand placed there with intention, a weight that carried something. "What you said to Gale at the church," Silas said low enough that it went no further than the two of them. "You were right." Soren looked at his father. The firelight moved across both their faces. "I have known it since I did not say anything that night," Silas said. "I wanted you to hear me say it." Soren looked at him for a long moment. This was the thing he had wanted, not precisely in these words, but in this register of honesty that his father rarely permitted himself. "What are you going to do with it?" Soren asked. Silas reached into his brass pocket and produced a folded document. He held it out. Soren took it, unfolded it, read it. The contracts, all 34 of them, signed for renewal through the spring of 1888. "I did it already," Silas said, 2 days ago. I did not wait for the dinner. I decided it was the right thing and did it." He looked across the room toward the kitchen wing where the sounds of clearing had begun. The dinner just confirmed what I already knew. Soren folded the document. He held it for a moment, feeling its weight. You should tell Ottilie Hoffman, he said. Silas considered this. Then he nodded. After the guests had gone and the workers had returned to their quarters after the last lamps in the outer rooms had been turned down, Ottilie was in the kitchen helping Vesta with the final clearing when Silas Whitmore appeared in the doorway. He stood there for a moment, a man in a good suit in a kitchen doorway, not where he was accustomed to standing, and the kitchen around him looked different with him in it, larger somehow and also more ordinary. He looked at Vesta first. The service was excellent, he said, as it always is. Vesta received this with the nod of a professional, confirming that the work was completed to standard. Then he looked at Ottilie. He held out the folded document. Renewed auction, he said. All 34. I signed it 2 days before Christmas. It was the right decision and it did not require a dinner to make it. But I wanted tonight to happen anyway because this community needed to see something. Ottilie took the document. She looked at it. Then she looked at Silas Whitmore and she understood something about him that she had not understood before. He was not a man who had done the right thing because it was convenient or strategic. He had done it before the strategy confirmed it, which was the more difficult form of doing the right thing and less common than it should be. Thank you, she said. Just those 2 words. But she meant the full weight of what they covered. Silas nodded once and left. Vesta waited until his footsteps had faded down the hall. Then she said, he signed them before Christmas. It was not a question. Yes, Ottilie said. Vesta was quiet for a moment. She picked up a cloth and resumed wiping down the range. He is not always easy to read, she said, but he tries to be fair. In this place and time, a man who tries to be fair is not nothing. Ottilie set the document on the shelf above her work table beside the notebook, and the caraway in the jar of starter that had once almost died and had come back stronger than before. She went back to the work in front of her. The kitchen settled into the comfortable quiet of 2 people who have been through something together and no longer need to explain themselves to each other. The next morning, the day after Christmas, the kitchen resumed its ordinary work. Ottilie arrived to find Vesta already at the range as always, and the smell of the first coals of the day in the air as always. She went to her corner. She fed her starter. She began the day's first loaves. An hour into the morning, Vesta set something on the work table between them. A folded piece of paper, its edges worn, as though it had been taken out and put away multiple times before this moment. Ottilie unfolded it. It was a recipe. Cornbread written out in Vesta's careful, deliberate hand, each step numbered, each measurement, specific, each ingredient, named with the precision of someone who has made a thing many hundreds of times and knows exactly what it requires. At the top of the page, in the same hand, a single line the way I make it. Whitmore Kitchen, Mississippi. Ottilie looked up. Vesta was at her range, her back to the room. You wrote this out several times before you gave it to me, Ottilie said. There was a pause. 3 times, Vesta said. First 2 were not right, third one was. Ottilie folded the paper and put it in the inside pocket of her work apron against her ribs, beside the notebook she always carried. She turned back to her dough. Outside, the day after Christmas settled over the Whitmore estate in thin winter sunlight, and the fields lay quiet in their off-season rest. And somewhere on the road to Clarksburg, a wagon was moving through the cold morning air, carrying someone home. On the workers' porch that evening, Sigrid was mending again. Ottilie sat in the other chair, and they watched the fields darken in the last light. Sigrid worked her needle and said nothing for a long time. Then she set the work down and reached into her apron pocket and placed something in Ottilie's hand. A piece of cornbread from the previous day's Christmas table, wrapped in cloth slightly stale from the overnight, but still carrying in its texture the evidence of Vesta's long craft. Ottilie looked at it, then at Sigrid. Sigrid had already picked up her mending again. Her face was composed, directed at the shirt in her lap, giving nothing away. It was not an apology because Sigrid Stern did not know how to apologize, and it was not a concession because she had not changed her mind about the things she believed. It was something smaller and more honest than either of those. It was an acknowledgement that a thing had happened and that it had gone well delivered in the only language available to a woman who had decided years ago that sentiment was a luxury she could not afford. Ottilie ate the piece of cornbread slowly there on the porch in the December evening, with the fields dark beyond the oak trees and Sigrid's needle catching the last light. It was stale and it was perfect. 3 years later, Ottilie Hoffmann stood on the deck of a ship in Mobile Harbor and watched the Alabama coastline recede into the haze. In her bag were two notebooks. The green one, Meisterbaum's, with its accumulated margin notes and the added pages of recipes she had developed or adapted during 3 years in Mississippi. And a second notebook, newer its pages, filling with her own handwriting, recording every technique and recipe and variation she had learned in that cookhouse. Hilda Brandt was not on the ship. She had made her decision the previous autumn, standing in the yard of the estate on a cool evening, with the harvested fields quiet around her, telling Ottilie without drama that she was staying. She had found work in Clarksburg that used her English and her organizational skills. She had found more to the point that the place she had arrived in, with no expectations, had become, through 3 years of daily experience, something she did not want to leave. Ottilie had embraced her and said nothing that would complicate the decision, because it was the right decision, and Hilda had earned it. Sigrid had returned to Bremen on the scheduled passage in the spring. She had left on Ottilie's bunk the morning of her departure a small carved wooden box that had belonged to her husband. Inside, a note in Sigrid's handwriting for the caraway. Clara had been using it to store the dried seeds since the day after Christmas. She still had it. The ship moved south toward the Gulf. Ottilie stood on the deck and held the rail and looked at the water going green and deep under the hull. She thought about the cookhouse in Clarksburg, which at this moment was filled with the smell of Vesta Hayes's morning work. She thought about the small piece of paper folded against her ribs, a recipe written out 3 times before it was right, given without ceremony by a woman who had measured the gift in the precision of its execution. She thought about the loaf that had no name, the one that had come into being, because a flour barrel was empty, and improvisation was the only available response. She thought about what Meisterbaum had written on the inside cover of his notebook. A good loaf requires 3 days and no impatience. The rest is craft, and craft can be learned. She had thought when she first read it that he was talking about patience as a virtue. She understood now that he was talking about something different. He was talking about the willingness to stay inside a difficult process without forcing it toward a resolution it was not ready to reach. You could not rush what needed time. You could only be present for it, do the work, and trust that the thing you were building had enough structure to hold. In Hamburg 6 months later, she opened a bakery in the Altona district. She made rye. She made the ginger cake from Baum's recipe every Christmas, and it was never exactly what Eugenia Whitmore's mother had made, and never exactly what Baum had made either. It was what she made, which was what it needed to be. She also made a loaf with no name, which the regular customers called the yellow dark bread, or occasionally just the American one. It was not a German bread. It was not a Southern American bread. It was the thing that had come into being in a small corner of a Mississippi cookhouse when 2 women who had no reason to trust each other had decided separately and for different reasons that the work mattered more than the argument. Sailors bought it. Merchants bought it. A few American soldiers passing through Hamburg in the years after stopped and looked at it with the expression of people encountering something half familiar in an unexpected place, the feeling of almost but not quite recognizing something from somewhere they had been a long time ago. Ottilie never explained it to them. Bread that needed explaining had something wrong with it. The loaf that held its own answer in every bite required nothing from her but the work of making it well, which was what Baum had taught her, and which was what Vesta Hayes had shown her again from the other side of a cast-iron stove in a county neither of them had chosen and both of them had made for a time into something real. That was the whole of it. The jar that almost died. The cloth left without explanation. The document signed before the dinner that was supposed to justify it. The recipe written 3 times until it was right. The piece of stale cornbread on a December porch passed without words between 2 women who had never agreed on anything and never needed to. Small things, the kind that textbooks leave out because they do not look from the outside like history. But every loaf that came out of Ottilie Hoffmann's Hamburg oven carried them forward, and every person who tasted it and paused and could not quite name what they were tasting was receiving without knowing it the accumulated weight of what it costs to stay in a hard place long enough for something true to come of it.